What up guys? I'm back, Sven here. Firstly, I'd like to clear up some confusion. Today we're talking about Gauss Fabricator, which creates 8 Gauss cannons. Observe the spelling of Gauss, in that these are clearly military-grade cannons made from the Gaussite resources and fire terrifying 1-damage shots at the enemies. Some confused individuals out there have been misrepresenting this mighty cannon and have referred to it as a helpless goose, which is an insult to my factual reality. Now that that's out of the way, Gauss Fab is a unit that works well if you buy it at the right time in the right set, but it's sometimes not easy to know when. This simple graph I created illustrates how Gauss Fab fares against 2 tantalum rays in a vacuum by comparing the total amount of damage dealt over time. If you think about it, for a little under the cost of 2 tantalums, you get 8 Gauss cannons over time, which seems like a great long-term value. However, Gauss Fab only does 3 damage by the 3rd turn, compared to the 10 damage of the tantalum rays. This fast damage is often much better than Gauss Fab, because of how short-term advantages translate into long-term advantages by forcing the opponent to buy defense instead of their own attackers. So my point is that the best time to buy Gauss Fab is when immediate damage is less valuable, like when it's gonna get absorbed by a big defender. Imagine this hypothetical scenario. Your opponent has an energy matrix on the board, and you have the option to either start with 2 tantalums or a Gauss Fab. Following that, you buy 2 tantalums per turn for the rest of the game with infinite supply. In this graph, I'm not counting the total damage dealt like the last graph, but rather the turn-by-turn damage count minus 4 from the matrix absorb. As you can see, the Gauss Fab isn't particularly far behind at any point, and starts being significantly advantageous by the 6th turn. This is why the most common and effective use of Gauss Fab is to supplement a high econ strat in a set with a big absorber, as long as there's a good way to spend your green to follow it up. Typically, you should buy 2 or 3 conduits in your opening to get a Gauss Fab as your first investment into attack, to start ramping up quickly after you're finished investing in drones. I'm not going to be covering games like these too much, since Gauss Fab only plays a small role in your strategy, and instead I'll be covering more edge cases and strong combos where Gauss Fab plays a larger role. These will be the kinds of situations that will largely favor the player with a ton of experience, who know exactly what to do, but hopefully with this video I can bridge the gap a little bit. First, let's take a look at how Gauss Fab functions in a standard breach-proof set. This is a set with no defenders in the Advanced tab, and only Hellhound as an attacker worth considering, but I don't think it's quite enough against all these strong green units. Trinity makes your economy breach-proof, Gauss Fab adds a lot of potential damage, and Cluster Bolt with Nevo Charge can shred through any defense you try to put up. In these breach-proof mirror situations, it's typically correct to buy Fab very fast, and with Trinity I would almost always go for it on turn 4 or 5. P1 doesn't have a great line to be getting it on turn 4 without being inefficient, so I chose to get it on turn 5. There's 2 reasons why you want to get Fab so quickly. First is that you want to get as many cannons as possible out of it, before it becomes vulnerable to your opponent attacking it. And it's also just very efficient in this situation. Neither of us are buying a Blast Forge, so the defender's advantage via absorb no longer exists, meaning that you don't need to be buying all of your damage at once to be efficient, and can just finish off buying the Trinity drones later. You can kinda look at Fab as an economic unit, since it's like having 2 Trinity drones and a conduit buying a Gauss cannon every turn. The total cost of 2 Trinities and a conduit is 20 gold and 2 green, which is significantly higher than the cost of Fab. And this is the main reason why you should prefer to be getting the Fab before all of your Trinity drones. The lifespan of Fab is a factor, but it takes so long to be a factor that it doesn't change the effectiveness that much. So we both decide that destroying each other's Gauss fabs is correct. He managed to destroy mine when it was on 6 lifespan, and the soonest I could destroy his when it was on 5 lifespan. In many cases, it would be horrible to target fab instead of Trinity, since 2 Trinities also produces an attacker per turn, but doesn't have lifespan. However, the thought process behind wanting to destroy Gauss fab in a set like this is that because Gauss Cannon is the only breach-proof attacker here, you run out of that cannon supply very quickly, and end up not having anything good to buy afterward. I was curious whether these fab kills were actually any good, since until now I've just been relying on a rule of thumb that a lot of others in the community share, and it's that fab is often worth destroying on 5 or higher lifespan in these situations. With the line of us both destroying each other's fabs, and strong tactics from both sides to follow up, the result ends up being a draw, but I'm left with significantly less health than him. I analyzed what happens when I choose to skip destroying his 5 lifespan fab, and this is the result. I end up with more health and he ends up with less, as well as 2 cannons in supply, so the result is just slightly better. Next, I analyzed what happens if both of us skip destroying the fabs, so he doesn't destroy my 6 lifespan fab as well, and we surprisingly end up with exactly the same health, and both have 2 cannons in supply. So the results show that for a set like this, that killing a lifespan 6 fab has a slightly better result, but killing a lifespan 5 fab has a slightly worse result. I wanted to test if those results could be consistent, so I went in analysis mode and played basically the same set, but with Dynamo instead of Trinity, since it's typical to get all 4 Dynamos, and you end up with a higher econ than that last set. I did the standard openings, and had P1 destroy P2's 6 lifespan fab, while P2 skips destroying P1's fab. P2 runs out of the cannon supply very quickly, but more conduits for clusters become a good use of gold afterward, since you lose your green income when your dynamos die, and P1 actually ends up not taking good advantage of cluster. P2 ends up winning after not destroying P1's lifespan 6 fab, but it was really close either way. Based on these results, we can assume that a lifespan 5 fab would almost never be worth destroying, unless your opponent can both quickly buy out the cannon supply and has literally nothing good to buy after cannon supply runs out, which is an extremely rare case, since then a breach-proof strategy is less likely to be correct in the first place. Here we have a set with Mahar Rectifier as the best absorber, and the openings in these sets with Mahar and Gauss Fab play out quite uniquely compared to most ways you would open Fab. There's no good reason to get a Blast Forge, with Aegis and Barrier providing more efficient soak than walls. So early on you want to rely only on Mahar Absorb for defense. So we both start with a Rectifier here, and in most cases you would never want to do this, because this is too early for Mahar to get good defensive value. But we're both kind of forced into doing this. If he bought Gauss Fab here against my Mahar, then I would kill his 2 engineers and buy a second Mahar, and suddenly he has no defense and no absorber against 4 damage, and can't buy Mahar anymore. Now I attack with Mahar to take out 2 Engies, and it's not really in my opponent's best interest to also attack with Mahar, since that would require him to either force field or barrier, which isn't great when I can just hold my Mahar next turn. A good rule of thumb to follow in these exact situations is that the player who gets the first Mahar can kill the 2 engineers without consequence, and that'll usually be P1. However, as P1 I'm getting Gauss Fab second, which evens things out, I think. You might be asking at this point why we got so little econ in a set with 4 absorb and such good soak units. Well, like I mentioned before, Gauss Fab can sometimes be looked at as if it were an economic unit. And that comparison is especially useful in a set like this, where we don't need Blast Forges and Animuses to get the super efficient, must-have units. Even on 12 and 14 drones, we're effectively spending tech, and getting exactly what we want while ramping damage quickly against the good defenders. Now that we have the Fab out, we need to start thinking carefully about when to get our second rectifier. We can assume that the opponent holds his rectifier to absorb my 3 damage. So against the 2 damage coming from his side, my rectifier will still be on 5 health next turn. The max damage he can buy next turn is 3 more, plus 1 from Gauss Fab and 1 from the Tantalum Click, for a total of 9 damage. So I can buy rectifier, then force field and hold a drone to defend. The rest of the game plays out normally with both of us just mostly buying defense, and this has been a good demonstration of how Mahar works with Fab. Now this is a set where I assumed that Gauss Fab would never get bought from the start. The lack of defense plus the highly efficient attackers like Grimbotch, Lucina, Lance-Tooth, and Arms Race pretty much removed Fab from my mind in this set. After seeing this crazy turn 1 double Auric opening, I was immediately thinking that this was some kind of crazy Tia or Lucina rush build, which I decided the best response to would be to get an early conduit to set up my own Tia quickly on a single conduit. At this point I know what's coming, but at the time this match happened I had never seen this Auric Gauss Fab opening, and it really caught me off guard. I was kinda stuck with the strategy I chose early on, since I got that conduit turn 1 and can't really transition to anything other than Tia from there. But even so, I thought Tia might work since my opponent won't have an absorber, and I can destroy his drones pretty easily. By the time my Tia runs out of stamina, I managed to clear out all of his drones completely, but I'm not left with much attack, and his Fab is still churning out Gauss cannons, so it's impossible for me to make any progress from here. This is a good example of what happens when Gauss Fab goes up against any ultra-aggressive strategy that relies on temporary attack, and I think something like a Windsor Rush going up against the Gauss Fab strat would also run into the same problems. The beefiness of the Gauss cannons and the Fab itself usually means that these strategies will hit a brick wall after the drones die. There's plenty of strategies in this set that would do well against the Gauss Fab strat, but the one I chose definitely wasn't going to ever win. In this set you wouldn't think that Gauss Fab would be a big player, since Gauss Charge and Nevo aren't the best support, and there isn't a big absorber. But recently I've been messing around with the rare combo of Fab and Ebb Turbine, and this is one of the matches where I decided to experiment and go for it. So this is the line, and it's really P2 specific since there's no great way for P1 to do something like this. We're also not really rushing Gauss Fab because we want to have enough econ to buy lots of Gauss cannons. This build only works really well if your opponent has 1 or no damage on this turn, since you really want to have the Ebb this turn rather than a wall, since the Ebb allows you to buy a wall with your Fab next turn rather than wasting blue. You should be fine unless your opponent does something like a turn 2 Animus in a set with Electivore. Since my opponent didn't buy any more damage, I can easily get another ebb with the ultimate goal of making a future transition to breachproof, by selling all of my drones to the ebbs as soon as possible, and defending my drones until then. If he did buy more damage, then I'd just buy a wall this turn and get the second ebb next turn. So now we're already running out of drones and defense, but this was all part of the plan. I buy another ebb here just to get some more breachproof econ, and ebb is actually the most resilient breachproof economic unit in the game, at 2 health per gold income. But you just don't see this very often since ebb is more expensive than other breachproof econ units. I end up crushing pretty hard, and this is a good testament to how great Fab is at enabling breachproof strategies. Another thing that makes Fab great is that it puts you in a nice spot in the late game, because if the game is close enough that both players are mutually breaching, the player who bought a Gauss Fab has a significant advantage. In this case, Flame Animus and Blood Pact weren't enough support for a red strategy. Although this replay contains the pre-buff Thermite Core and Blood Pact, I spent a while analyzing this set with the current unit balance, and couldn't find a way to win with a Flame Animus strat, and it wasn't even close. This one is similar to the last set in the way that Fab doesn't have a ton of support, but there's the capability to sell your drones with Steelforge. He goes for the standard P2 Gauss Fab rush. However, this build usually doesn't work very well against an early Animus or really any kind of damage rush, since you can't afford the Blast Forge for a wall until after you buy the Fab. In this case, all I can really get are Tarsiers, but if there was Electivore or Grimbotch in the set, then the Fab rush would get smashed by the fast damage, because their defense would be incredibly inefficient. Throughout the rest of the game, I end up not buying a single unit from the random set, since none of them were really doing anything for my strategy. Shredders would have been great, but at the time I didn't find any opportunity to fit them in. Near the end of the game here, we start seeing the weaknesses of a breachproof transition in this set specifically. After all the drones are gone, then the Steelforge becomes useless. And since he can't afford Gauss charges anymore, the conduits also become useless, and that's a ton of resources being wasted. Base set won this pretty convincingly, so remember to be very careful when choosing to rush out Fab, and have a long-term plan for your resources. Here's a set where Gauss Fab seems strong upon first impression, since there's huge Absorb with Defense Grid, and a decent soak unit in Cauterizer, and I open with the intention to go for it. He takes a different approach and sets up a double arms race turn rather quickly, and this puts me in a kind of awkward position since I need to set up the defense grid quickly against that. So I float 8 gold here to get Fab, Double Blast Forge, and Wall. By this point, I'm significantly behind in attack. He already has 12 and I'll be having 5 next turn. He finally has to make his own defense grid a whole 2 turns later than I did. And I put out a huge double Tesla turn, but even after that I'm still behind in damage, and don't have my own Animus for the Frost Brooders. I mess up here and allow a D-grid breach by accident. But after this game I went back and analyzed it, and saw that it didn't really make a difference. He's both up on damage and has these 2 brooders doing work. And the reason this went so poorly for me is that Gauss Fab actually doesn't compare that well to the most efficient attackers in Prismata. In this case, Arms Race became incredibly efficient as a way to quickly ramp damage against D-Grid, because I couldn't use the engineers they created for many turns afterward. Arms Race also forced me to get my D-Grid very quickly, and the triple Blast Forge is an expensive investment to make early in the game. I've also had matches with big absorbers where super efficient attackers like Sinestro completely crush a Gauss Fab strat. So I'd say in non-breach-proof sets that you should avoid Fab if the other attackers are very strong. That's it, guys. Big thanks for the incredible support I've been receiving in the YouTube comments, and especially on my Twitch stream. These videos would definitely not be happening without all of you guys. Tia Thurnax is up next.